Originally for this particular slot, I had asked Lloyd Miller to see if he could come in and talk to us about legal issues, which would have been great, but Lloyd was traveling. And, you know, I started to think of the other attorneys that I know that are native law attorneys, and there's a number of really qualified folks out there that I was thinking of reaching out to fill that slot. But as I was talking with Carol and the other folks at APU and thinking about the overall purpose of this class, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to actually give some of my own personal knowledge about a situation that I ultimately was asked to work on that dealt specifically with the Alaska Federation of Natives. And it turns out to what I think become an interesting case study because it impacts a lot, well, it impacts everything that we've talked about today. So Byron gave some excellent background in the reading material that we've had, has tremendous background on the origin and the formation of the Alaska Federation of Natives. And I think it's fair to say that without the organizational structure and the will of those people working at AFN, the committees that worked for the Lands Committee, and just the general organization itself, the voice of Alaska Native people would have been really hard to hear in the settlement. And so AFN has for years been a structure that Alaska Native people have used to give some voice to general policy considerations. And you can see from the readings and from what we've heard so far that it originally was a relatively small group of folks that had a common interest in trying to achieve a land claim settlement. The group ultimately became incorporated in, I think it was 1966, and has been around for many years and has essentially changed over time. Originally, AFN really did have a primary mission, and the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and affecting public policy, making sure that the important provisions that were going to be later considered in ANELP, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, that all of those various federal statutes had protections for Alaska Native people to the greatest extent possible. So for the majority of its life, and what it does today, is to continue to be a vehicle for public policy and sending folks to the state legislature, to Congress, to make sure that our voices as Native people are heard. And originally, the structure of AFN really was tied very closely to the formation of ANCs. And so you have an original structure of AFN that had Class A members who were entitled to vote and be on the board of directors. And those Class A members were split up into three subcategories. So A1 members were ANCSA corporations, the 13 ANCSA corporations, including the 13th corporation. And the 13th was added a little bit after the original 12 came in as it was established. And these were corporations, members of the board of directors of AFN with voting rights, the ability to make change, make public policy. And then a second tier of Class A membership, or a second subset of Class A members, also were included in the original organization. And these were really kind of the fundamental organizations that helped form the core leadership of AFN. And those came from the nonprofit Native associations, because the nonprofits really, because of their access to federal money, really were the first kind of foundations, in my view, of leadership. And so we see a number of the leaders that formed the groups that were going to consider how to advocate for land claims coming from nonprofits that existed at the time. So the original 12 members from nonprofit associations around the state were members of AFN. And then the villages were added as a subcategory of Class A membership, and that's what it said, village, any Alaska Native village, or any merged village, or any recognized group under ANCSA shall be eligible to become a Class A member. And so that's how AFN originally was chartered, with villages, nonprofit organizations, and ANCSA regional corporations. And so AFN has been around for over 40 years now. And over time, I think what has happened from my point of view at least is that as the corporations matured, each of them became more and more sophisticated in the way that they would deal with their own lobbying and reach out efforts to the state and congressional delegations. They learned about the importance of having lobbyists, and as many of them do, in Washington, D.C. And they learned to advocate for themselves to a huge extent without the necessity of having AFN do it. AFN was still very useful and is still very useful for issues that affect Alaska Natives on a statewide basis. But for more singular issues, AFN became less and less relevant to the corporations for their own particular issues as the corporations matured. Simultaneously, a similar thing was happening with the nonprofits. Today, our nonprofits are sophisticated, world-class nonprofits that provide services to huge numbers of Native American people living in Alaska, and they've figured out a way to make their way to Congress and ask for what they need themselves, and that happens every day, right, Denise? Including last night. So as time has gone by, a number of issues have come before AFN, and they have been substantive issues that have required a common Native voice. And those issues still exist to this day. Issues like subsistence, for example, where AFN played an important role in trying to preserve some subsistence rights for our people and combating the state's efforts to take away those rights, enlisting attorneys and scholars and all the folks necessary to form an effective policy argument to Congress that says, this is what we were promised, this is what we should get in terms of access to our fish and our game. So that being said, one of the pieces that we talked about with Byron in the room was, well, what about the tribes? And over time, as you all know, there has been a tension that has continued to arise that was created by ANCSA itself, and that's the tension about what about the sovereign nations that existed here in Alaska that have their own right to sovereignty, their own right to use of the land. You know, what about those folks? What about the tribes? Well, you know, historically, as I was growing up, after Byron, I'd say, I don't recall having a huge sense, but I'm an urban native, so that just could be me. But I don't have a huge sense of hearing much about tribes until probably the 1970s, I guess, when, well, late 1970s, and it was more in the context of tribal people in Alaska understanding the Indian movement that was happening in the lower 48, and to some extent emulating that and the demand for sovereignty and rights and respect that those folks were having. But it never got to be a significant deal for the majority of Alaska Natives, I don't think. I think there continued to be, from very early on, the folks that recognized that we had tribal rights as people, as Alaska Native people here in Alaska, and felt by the creation of ANCSA that a lot of those tribal rights had been stripped away or illegally taken or ignored. And along the way, I think over time, the importance of tribes, federally recognized tribes, if that is really a thing, and it's a legal thing, but if that's what makes you a tribe, that has occurred. And now we have 233 federally recognized tribes here in Alaska. And they have become as much a legitimate part of the Alaska Native culture in our state as any of the other entities and organizations that we have. So I think by 2009, inside the membership of the Alaska Federation of Natives, this tension was being felt to a significant extent, and the message was coming from several regions, ANC regions around the state, that this is something that we just can't ignore anymore, that we have a problem as ANCs because we, in some circumstances, don't have the relationship with the tribes that we should have. And certainly that was true, I think, here in the Seri region, where our tribes are, like Seri itself, they're predominantly urban tribes, but still they have their own tribal sense of sovereignty and their own tribal rights and their own tribal responsibilities to their tribal members, which are actually quite different than those that a native corporation owes to its shareholders. And so we were seeing as a company a division that was occurring that needed to be assuaged. And I think the same thing was true in other regions across the state. I think the tribal people in Doyon and the tribal people in Arctic Slope region had similar tensions. And it's not fair to say that it was all across the state, because certain regions simply did not have that issue for whatever reason. To the extent that Koniag is a smaller, more insulated region, I think they have done a tremendous job of coordinating their tribes and their village corporations and their regions. But back at AFN, the word tribe never shows up in the foundational documents of the nonprofit. And that was troubling, because if AFN is going to continue to be relevant, many of us believe that we really needed to include tribes as members, voting members, entitled to sit on the board of directors of the nonprofit, so they could have their voices be heard too, that we could assist in lobbying for tribal rights of our people, because frankly, as you went around the room at the boardroom at AFN, it turns out that darn near every one of those folks considers themselves to be individually a tribal person too. And I think that's predominantly true of most Alaska Natives. For those of us born in Mountain View, harder to prove, but because of that, because of the fact that there's a identity, kind of a multiple identity, I guess, of being a tribal person, being an ANC shareholder or descendant, that the fact that they were never really built into the structure of AFN was considered to be a problem. So, seems like a relatively simple fix. In 2009, at the convention of the Alaska Federation of Natives, the one place and the one organization that can actually call a convention and invite every Alaska Native from around the state, and they will show up. That's the power of the AFN. It's the one organization that can actually do that and have legitimacy when it does it. So at the convention, a vote was taken by the delegation to essentially admit tribes and send a directive to the board of directors to figure out how it's going to be done. That seemed like a fairly easy thing to understand, but it turned out to be a much, much harder thing to accomplish. And I think the reasons behind that, and if any of you were participating in any of those discussions, feel free to chime in, but But I think the reasons behind that really kind of go to the fundamental tension that exists in ANCSA and continues to exist for us as Alaska Native people today. So in 2009, a push was made to admit tribes into the Alaska Federation of Natives. And a committee was formed to go ahead and figure out how best to do that. And it was a committee that had multiple meetings and a very complex plan. Tara Sweeney and Gloria O'Neill, Tara Sweeney from Arctic Slope and Gloria O'Neill from Cook Inlet Tribal Council, two brilliant women in their own right, were the chairs of the committee to come up with this. And they had public hearings that all Alaska Natives were invited to participate in, and they had multiple public hearings, and they had multiple meetings, and they had the full array of attorneys that were available to companies like Arctic Slope and Cook Inlet Tribal Council, and a variety of plans were put out, and it was interesting because the response was relatively quiet from the board of directors in terms of embracing this directive from the people. And from my perspective, as I participated and watched what was going on, it was fascinating to see folks that had been involved with AFN for many years. AFN's board is really a board of multiple chiefs, and they're all, veteran Alaska Native leaders in their own right on the AFN. I happen to be a series representative on that board and far less experienced in the Native politics than most, but it wasn't hard to figure out fairly early on that most people on the board didn't think anything was broken, that it was working just fine, that since they were tribal people, then they were also tribal representatives, even though nobody had officially made them the tribal representative. And if we did anything, it would result in a board that was too big and unmanageable, or it'd be too expensive, or you would never get a quorum. And a lot of reasons were thrown out why not to do what we were told to do by the convention. And how you, as a lawyer, I can tell you that to change an organization, you have to organically change it in its articles and its bylaws. And so what we were talking about were methods of changing the articles and the bylaws so that we could accommodate this mandate. Yes, Teal.
Just a quick question, and I don't think it'll take us too far.
Yeah.
Was this an organic redefinition? Because I think it's worthy in terms of the tribal definition, or was this more politically motivated about that time? Because about that time we had different change in administration too, so the recognition of tribes was more of a focus also.
I think that the motivations for the folks, the different regions that supported it were probably different. I think from the SERI perspective, we wanted to be supportive, even though we are an urban corporation, we wanted to be supportive of tribal representation, and we knew that that was an issue within our region. But we're also aware that the Obama administration in particular had refocused its efforts to assist Native people to tribes and had very explicitly done that. So I think we were aware of that. I don't think that was the motivating factor. But I do think that the predominant motivating factor for asking for the change and fighting for the change was just the recognition that if we didn't make the AFN be a larger tent, then we would have people sitting outside. And I don't think AFN continues to be viable if a big portion of the relevant Native population sits outside the tent. So they have a right to a voice too, in my view. And I think that's really the motivating part of it. But it became clear as we struggled with how to implement this directive from the convention that the Alaska Native people, and from corporation to corporation, from region to region, and from village to village, had a complete different viewpoint, a singular viewpoint on the issue. And how they did things, or how they viewed themselves in Alaska region, was completely different than how the Native people in Chulista region viewed themselves. And the folks from Arctic Slope, how they worked together or did not work together, and what their internal struggles were between organizations, had no relationship to what might be occurring in, say, Ceres region. You know, they were just, there was all these differences, and it was all the differences between us that really started to become the impediment to change. And it became apparent after working through this and having the committee come up with a number of plans, and then having the board look at the plans and vote to go ahead and try to implement this one. And then so we agreed that there needs to be change, and we agreed that somebody needs to work on the bylaws to change it. And then spending another year just trying to work on the bylaws so that we could accomplish the change that the board had agreed upon, bringing that process forward, and then ultimately the board choosing to not amend the bylaws after having worked on these bylaws for 2 years. It just became completely frustrating. Questions at this point? Yeah. So it was disheartening to a great extent to those corporations that had felt strongly about it. And I guess the not widely publicized reality was that it was such a disappointment to not include the tribal people of Alaska in the Alaska Federation of Natives that several regional corporations were ready to leave the Alaska Federation of Natives. And that created a crisis point. And so that ultimately resulted in getting back together and figuring out, you know, what do we do? Do we just let these regions leave the Alaska Federation of Natives? Is that where we want to be as Alaska Native people right now? Do they not think AFN has value? You know, what's behind this? What's the rationale? And you know, is it true that we can hear a call for change at AFN but not respond to it? Can we really do that as directors? So it became a source of tension, and the source of tension, I think, really at the end of the day relates back to the very issues we heard about today. And that's the issues of tribal rights versus access to the land and ownership, a division between who believes they have control, and a lack of understanding about the relevance and importance of tribes in our modern existence as Native people. So,
just maybe a little bit as you talk about that. How about so right now there's, you know, as I'm hearing what you're saying, there's a certain board composition, and that's all kind of known, your perspective, and you know, it's been a stable thing dealing with statewide issues.
right.
When you talk about bringing in a whole bunch of big new group that may have very different views, I already said that everybody has dramatically different views, at least singular. How about just the concerns about hijacking the underlying purpose or the overall direction of AFN? Was that something that was considered or worried about?
Well,
because it's a big step bringing
it sounds like it's really a big step, but the reality is that it's not a very big step at all, because for a couple different reasons. First of all, the Class A3 membership that included villages really included not just village corporations. It included, in some cases, IRA councils. In some cases, it was the village corporation, or some cases, it was the tribal entity that sent representatives to AFN. And AFN, in a different class of membership, had already allowed for tribes to be members of AFN. They just couldn't be voting members and on the board. So in terms of its membership, AFN could easily say, we've got 163 tribes as members of AFN, so why is this such a big deal? Well, it's who's sitting around the table sometimes that really makes a difference in terms of affecting policy. And if you're not at the table, then you're not going to be able to create tremendous change.
And I guess that's my question. So that you were inviting them to the table, which could affect change.
Yeah, and how do you do that? How do you do that?
Come in and say, we don't want Greg on the board anymore.
Absolutely, you know, and how do you do that? And you know, and you have a number of folks, as we all know, having worked with boards of directors, some directors are directors for a long time, and they like to stay on their position on the board of directors. And I think that's threatening sometimes to them to bring change into that certainty for, you know, for that position. But at the end of the day, we were trying to convince them that it could be done without significant change, really. That it was more of a recognition than having to create a brand new structure, that the existing structure could accommodate what we needed to do. Denise and then Malin.
And I think the one thing about AFM, and the reason that AFM was created is to make sure that there is a unified Alaska Native voice. So if we don't have the tribes at the table, then we really can't even begin to have the dialogue or the conversation. That intentional conversation is how do we as Alaska Natives people, no matter what hat we're wearing, begin to speak as a unified voice on a lot of these issues that we have been discussing here today.
Yeah.
And you just really can't begin to have the conversation unless you have the people in the room, and the only way to have them is give them a voice to be in the room and a place to be in the room.
Yeah. Malin and then Teal.
Do you think that was severely impacted AFN's stand with outside politicians or even in-state politicians if they had lost some of those regional?
Yeah, I do. You know, the regions that were contemplating pulling out of AFN were all significant regions in their own. I think all the regions are significant, first of all, but to have regions with proven economic power that are capable of, you know, representing themselves if they need to, pull out of something as important as AFN, which does have a statewide need to it, I think it would have been significant.
So then the second prong of that is to the corporation that was considering pulling out. As you said, they have their own ability to lobby on their own singular needs, but how effective they've been to be a part of any native.
Yeah, I think it. I mean, had it happened, it would have been damaging to both participants, to AFN and to the corporations that were pulling out. Because I think what Denise is saying is what we read about in particularly AJ's book, the importance of presenting a unified voice as you go to anybody, especially Congress, to ask for something or to preserve something. And you know, from my personal experience, when you don't have that unified voice, then you lose the strength of your argument sometimes. So I think that it would have been significant. Teal?
As we listen to Byron and the conversation has evolved today, it seems to me that the beginning of ANGSA was about all natives, but it was generated by kind of a corporate resource type demand or need. And today, I believe it's still there, but the economics have changed for the corporations. We've become substantial and significant, but it's also about politics. And so while the tribes really don't have any resources, if you will,
Yeah.
It's a political arm that they use and a priority. But administration recognizes them, and all of a sudden the resource arm doesn't have the leverage that it needs. Now it's a tribal organization. That's going to come together at some point, and that's what we're experiencing. As you described.
Yeah, exactly.
So functionally, it was inevitable to happen.
Well, yeah, that's what I believe as well. But it's hard to convince a structure that's been in place for 40 years to change, you know.
I would argue, Teal, that there's a third element in that it's economic, political, and cultural. Because I am a Fognak Native Corporation Coney shareholder, but I'm also just as proud to be a tribal member of the Native Village of Fognak and Native Village of Fort Lyons. In our region, when this concept come before us, our regions, in our regional caucus at AFN, we said, well, of course, we'll add the tribes, because in our mind, from our region, the tribes are already at the table with us. In our regional caucus, the tribes have just as much voting power as CANA or Coniag or a Fognak Native Corporation. So for us, it was a no-brainer. I recognize that wasn't the case in all the regions. But.
Yeah.
I share the same status as you, and I acknowledge the cultural piece I had put with the tribes, but I see where it is a third off.
Yeah. I just think sometimes we misunderstand what David Case will probably talk about tomorrow, and that's the importance of making sure that we don't lose the sovereignty that we have as tribal people, and having that be the tool to leverage some of the things that seem to have been taken away through ANCSA, whether that be subsistence or voting rights or whatever the case may be. But for those major issues, we know today that we still have problems as Native people, and if we don't have a sound vehicle to address those, whether they be a tribal issue or a general civil issue like voting, or whether they be an issue that particularly affects a corporation, I think there's tremendous value to this day to have the Alaska Federation of Natives out there. I still am working to modernize the nonprofit corporation because internal modernization is called for when you've got a nonprofit that hasn't really been changed for 40 years. There's just certain things that we do now as companies, policies and procedures and evaluation of staff and that sort of thing that don't ever really occur right now at AFN that still need to be changed and tinkered with a little bit. But so the job isn't done, but I did want to describe it to you and just get your opinion, because this seemed to me to be something worth fighting for, and at the end of the day it was something that the regional corporations, at least some of them, were ready to go to the mat on, and it was going to the mat for somebody else, really. So
originally, before the reorganization, if I'm wrong, it was divided sort of 2/5 corporation vote, 2/5 nonprofit vote, and 1/5 village vote. So is there a reason that now it's kind of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 with the 3 and 4, A3 and 4 kind of combining to equal the same as the corporate and the nonprofit
exactly.
vote. So is there a reason that they didn't give them, both village corporation and the tribal entities, the same power as the nonprofit and the corporation, make it 1/4, 1/4, 1/4? If that made sense.
Yeah, no, and the whole voting structure was difficult to come up with, and I'm still not sure it's completely finalized. We're going to vote some way this year, but that's still kind of a little bit of a work in progress in terms of how the voting structure will work. But I think that in the final negotiation that resulted in a change of the bylaws to AFN, the idea that the number of board members had to remain the same, and that there be a special recognition that tribes were eligible to be voting members on the board of directors. Those two concepts were the most important concepts. And there were some other ancillary items of concern. But those two concepts in particular, not to make the board so large that it would be completely unwieldy, and to I'm thinking of a third one now, but to not make so much change that we couldn't get the votes to pass it. All those were of concern. And then I guess the other item, and the one that I'm still not sure how I ended up being so involved in all of this, but an executive governance committee was also created to continue to tinker with the company so that it would be more modern and have the sorts of internal controls that we want to see in any nonprofit. And so we continue to work on that, and I continue to chair that committee for now.
Have you made any progress on the rest of the list that was?
Yeah, not much. And it has something eerily to do with the fact that I had to spend 6 months in Idaho this year. So But we'll get back to it. We're not done with it yet. But
So do you expect that this will be a major issue at the convention this year, since it's not yet been resolved?
well, I think that the fact that the tribes are now part of AFN has been resolved, and I think that's the core issue. That's the promise that the board made in response to the delegation, and the resolution of that issue, I think, is enough to celebrate, and damned if I don't do it. Go ahead, Denise.
I have another question, and it's kind of a two-pronged question, because I think it goes back to one of the issues that some of the ANCOs are going to have to deal with. And it's where, when we're looking at votes, and I'll start over. I know that for some descendants, and I've heard this from individuals whose birth dates are after 1971, have indicated they come into AFN and they're just not quite sure where they fit. Do they go over here and sit with the regional corporation? Do they go over here and sit with the village corporation? And I know that the ANCs and everybody else, we're going to have to figure out a way how to deal with this down the road so we can embrace everybody. But when we're talking about for every 25 persons based on the original ANSC enrollment, we have a lot of people in the room that weren't on the original ANSC roll.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So,
Right.
How we define that and how we define who was going to comprise that 25.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole structure of how you pay dues to AFN is still based upon what happened in 1971. You know, it's based upon that original enrollment. So, you know.
Well, and if they changed it now, it would make some regions way more powerful than the others because of open enrollment and other things. Like
Yeah.
they're already.
Yeah, the methodologies that we've had to look at to try and figure out how you could make it more equitable, they're just too complicated, you know. Yeah. But I thought that was worthy of discussion. Go ahead.
But don't you think that by saying even that whole idea around equitability, that gets away from this greater sense that we have about our community or our connection to one another? And so if we focus purely on how many votes or numbers, don't we step back from the intent of involving tribes to start out with? In some regard, that idea that they're a part of our Native community that up until this point were only invited guests, not fully welcome parts of it. And so, because I think when Byron was talking, so that's one piece of it is that I think that we could take our own corporate, as we are, brains that we have worked on for the last 40 years and try to figure it out from that piece that we've been conditioned to.
Right.
Or we could step back and say, okay, this is like finding out that we have this family member who now lives in our community and we're not going to invite them to our Christmas dinner.
Right.
So that, in my mind, it kind of feels like,
Right.
I have some relatives like that.
right?
Yeah.
But then to take it a step further, I also think that that when Byron was talking, one thing that kind of resonated with me is that idea that when I think it was, maybe it was, I don't know who asked it, but, what would you have done differently?
Yeah,
And he said, well, I would have been more thoughtful. And, he had talked a lot about this idea that we've given up and those rights, but that they still might have been things that may have been given up, because at that moment, tribal organizations, that wasn't something that it wasn't really in the consciousness necessarily of everyone that was in that room. But
Right.
his point to me that really drove home was this idea that, but we would have had a discussion about that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of those places where it's about the discussion, it's about the conversation more than the answer even.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't disagree with you. I think that, and that's kind of where I wanted to take us next, is kind of debrief Byron a little bit, because there's not a hell of a lot more to say about AFN, but
There's probably a lot to say, but maybe better not say.
not with a microphone on. Yeah. But no, I think you're right. I mean, that's kind of what a couple things struck me about what Byron said. The first thing, and we can start there, was I always had the distinct impression that there was a lot more dealing going on, that we had more cards to play in what was decided with the Alaska Native Claims settlement than Byron described. You know, at the end of the day, I heard him say that it was, you know, the legislators going into a room and then you found out what popped out, you know. So it was kind of a black box settlement for us. And I don't have any reason to believe that that's not absolutely true. It's not surprising, but the impression by folks that are detractors of Alaska Native Claims settlement are that we have consciously dealt away our best cards, and I'm not really sure that's what happened. Do you guys have opinions on that?
I have a question on that, actually.
Yeah.
So Greg, there's pictures of people signing it. Was it law when it came out of the black box, or did it become...
When it came out of Congress, yeah, when it came out of Congress, it was a statute, and it was signed off by the folks that signed statutes, including the president.
So the pictures or the the discussion about Native leaders signing, that was just some sort of ceremonial?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. We can ask David that, but I don't know the answer to it. But I mean, that's really the distinguishing thing. Yeah, I think the picture in the book is the 7I agreement. That was a private agreement amongst. Yeah, yeah, and that's the difference between a law and a treaty, right? That's the complete difference. The law comes from Congress. It's capable of being changed, you know, taken away. And a treaty is a document that's an agreement between two sovereigns. And that's not capable of being easily changed. A treaty is a treaty. It's a contract. And that's different than a statute, which is changeable. And we've seen that ANCSA was changed many times as is necessary. That's, in my view, the cool thing about it. Although I think that's something that you judiciously do, is change a federal statute that affects all of our people. But it's capable of being changed and has been changed as circumstances dictate.
Well, and I also think on that same note, what I wrote down was that, up until then, there was, and even as they started to enter into this idea that they were going to have, an act or an agreement, if you will, with Congress, or they were going to go and talk about that at a federal level, there was this apprehension that, we as individual groups need to go through the court, and the Court of Claims in order to get the best deal. And were we leveraging our ability to do that by going and saying, hey, we want this? And I think, Udall's, and I didn't ask Byron this, but I do think that as I've read and as I've heard, I mean, a lot of times we don't really think about it, but Udall putting a stop to the state being able to select lands was really key in getting, some partners, if you will, in the state of Alaska interested in helping us get that done. Yeah. And, so that was something that we didn't really talk about, but, as I read and I know about it, I do think that was key, because he did talk about the idea that we started to talk the lingo that was being talked in the state. And so I thought that was something that maybe I would have liked to talk a little bit more about, and maybe, David will be able to talk a little bit.
Yeah.
And dive into that a little.
I think it'd be really interesting from the federal participants that decided this is what we're going to do to figure this one out, to just move it along. Maybe it was just protectionism from the federal government, but maybe it was a conscious decision to get to the bottom of what this land claims was going to be. But it certainly did create incentives. It created incentives for the state, and then you add on the significant economics of Prudhoe Bay on top of that, and big oil coming in and saying, we are ready to drill. I think that was as important an incentive to get things done.
Well, and the oil companies were also a very big political voice.
Sure.
That were also,
Yeah.
you know, there was a lot of their success and investment that was leveraged at that moment.
Sure. And leveraged on Congress as well. So.
Hey, Melanie,
Yeah.
when you called out the state there, were you simply saying the state as in the state of Alaska, or the state as a collective?
Yeah, so I was thinking more along the state of Alaska, but Byron, you know, I think his idea was more about us as a collective state, you know, made up of all these different entities. But from my perspective, looking at the state constitution and listening to Vic Fisher speak, that's one thing that Vic says about the convention, was that he felt like that, like the tribal entity or the indigenous people of Alaska were really left out of that state conversation as we became a state. And so, and I think that that's been sort of a case in point that has kind of continued. And so for me, that was something that I look to whoever that is in leadership to say, okay, how are you going to right what the state maybe hasn't done with our Native organizations and Native people, and then how are you going to grow that? Because I would say that we're not at the space where I would like us to be at as a state.
Like recognizing Alaska Natives' preference for subsistence and
Yeah, and tribal
tribes.
entities.
Yeah.
And so, you know, not just looking at the, as Byron said, not just looking at the economic engine that we provide, but looking at us from that cultural perspective and understanding the value piece that we bring to Alaska. So, the other thing is education is vastly dependent upon the state, and oftentimes Alaska Native children, you know, by all of our accounts, are not faring as well in our education system, and yet we oftentimes have State of Alaska come back to the Native community and say, well, what are you going to do for your kids? And, you know, so for me, that I want to turn it around and say, but you have, it's not a privilege for our kids to be educated, it is a right of our kids, just as every other kid in the system.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, I mean, I think, again, soft
So
listening.
the other thing that I thought was particularly fascinating was to hear Byron's recollection of the settlement of the 7I issue, and thanks for bringing that up, Teal. You know, having practiced law for so many years, I can tell you that in almost every circumstance, it's just the drag and the price of litigation that results in settlement. But how this particular case was settled and the coming together that he described, I thought was fascinating because it makes so much sense. You know, your thoughts on that, Teal?
I was particularly motivated just to ask a question because of the reading. I'd say it's as simple as that. It
Yeah.
was fascinating to read, but also because, you know, as I said, I'm presenting at the next LSI with a couple of other of my counterparts at the regional corporations, and gathering the information as it had to do with BB&C is one thing. Reading about it as it had to do with the whole and the creation is another. And then working through that whole issue. You know, where are we at? I mean, what's fresh and new to talk about that today? So I wanted to catch a glimpse of firsthand what he had to say, and then talking about today and going forward, I think is a separate issue. So that's why I wanted to hear that.
Yeah. Well, you know, that process of it becoming so painful that you just have to do something, you know, that's a lot of the time, a lot of the way decisions are ultimately settled. But I can just see, you know, those phone calls being made and, you know, let's get this thing figured out. I thought that was pretty cool.
But even when they came to that point, it took long.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
Seriously, these huge binders full of all these various agreements
improvements and, wow.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
they may have kicked the lawyers out of the room when they first started, but they came back in at some point.
Good for them.
There was something that floated to the top for me, and I wrote it down here. He said that there's got to be a native way to deal with this, which was very significant to me, because I still believe that while we have developed ourselves and refined ourselves, we still function in that unique fashion sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think we come back to that. And while we may be kind of on parallel tracks, we do have a connection that way. As he described the Anxious CEOs group, there's a legal group, there's a land group, there's others, but I think we still function that way, and hopefully we never lose that piece.
I also thought it was fascinating to hear from Byron about having grown up in a boarding school and having those early relationships. I think that made so much sense to me.
It was such a vastly different perspective on boarding schools than you've read about. You know, in my undergrad, when I studied Alaska Native, minor in Alaska Native Studies, we spent a lot of time on boarding schools and their cultural impact and their social impact and their impact on the family. And he had a very different take.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah.
Almost a catalyst.
Well, you know, that...
It really was.
Yeah.
And then you look at our generation and we didn't have that.
Right.
And so we are in our 20s. Yeah, that's right. Now building those relationships where they were, they had years ahead of us. Many of us in our introductions, we talked about the fact that one of the things that we're getting from this experience is the relationships we're building with
Exactly.
our peers.
Exactly.
We do have the benefit of their experience, and they've set the tone, by starting and continuing those meetings, and the groups
Right.
we work in already have a culture we simply need to continue with. Right? So
We have different assets. We have a group full of college educated individuals who are on our way to executive leadership, but we're missing that piece of building those relationships in high school. It's just a unique asset that generation had that we don't necessarily have.
Yeah, because it creates a trust relationship.
Right.
Because I recognize, from my mom going to boarding school, that she has a relationship with Byron that I don't know that my mom and Byron have seen each other twice since they graduated from high school. And that is 52 years ago, okay? They graduated the same year. And yet there's a connection with Byron and me vicariously through my mom's relationship with him for 4 years.
Yeah.
And there, so I think that there's something about that is very profound, that you're right, we don't have, and that's one of the reasons why I think as we build models to help grow leadership, we have to do some
Right.
on
because-
purpose creating of
Absolutely,
that.
because if you look at our cultures, relationships have always been key. Hunting relationships between partners were critical in our villages. When you took a kayak from Uzinki to a Fognak, you had to declare your relationship when you landed on the beach to the other people who lived in the village. And so boarding schools, in some regard, created a new vehicle for creating those relationships. And so now we're in the position where we have to do that, and we're doing it in this classroom, which is different.
Yeah.
But it's still, relationships are critical in the Native community.
And that still continues, because I graduated from a boarding school, and some of my best friends are from that time, and I could call on them, and they don't have separate agendas or,
Yeah.
want to ask them for advice. It's as a friend, not this counterpart to a
Right.
corporation or whatnot. So.
Right.
I think boarding schools have changed because going to Mount Edgecombe was a requirement. It wasn't an option, it was a requirement. You're going to go, well, whatever boarding school, but using Mount Edgecombe as an example. And now Mount Edgecombe is a premier school that is extremely competitive. I mean, you have to have a 4.0 GPA to get into Mount Edgecombe these days. It's very competitive. So I mean, how it's shifted, you know what I mean, totally, completely, as far as how we view Mount Edgecombe. I'm not sure that all the other boarding schools are that way. But, and I wanted to add on one of the things that I heard Byron say, and I know that there was a lot of dialogue when ANSCA turned 40 and they were holding small group discussions and everything. And he reiterated it today, is that ANSCA was viewed as, was set up to fail. I mean, I've heard a lot of Alaska Native leaders that were there at that time and kind of going back with a 40-year hindsight and saying, everything was going to stop in 20 years. It was going to be taxable in 20 years. The stock was going to be sellable in 20 years. There was all of these implementation plans that were put into place. There was things put into place such as fishing and hunting rights, loss of water, and all of those things that were really kind of put in place almost to divide in a lot of ways. And so I think it's interesting that after all of the years that it still is a very, very successful model. I know he didn't talk too much about the fact that that a lot of people view a lot of the provisions that were actually included where ANSCA were included to make sure that it actually failed.
And it was nativized over time. Like it started out as an opportunity to fail and to slowly assimilate all those things away, take it away from the native people. But then the native people nativized it, right?
Yeah, by having the ability to actually go back and get amendments. I mean, made a conscious decision that the stock wasn't going to be restricted. It was going to be restricted.
Any other download on Byron?
I just wanted to say that I have profound respect for people of that generation. I mean, because things could have gone completely different. It could be just another footnote in, Native American culture just being swept aside and, assimilated into the rest of the United States. It could be just another footnote saying that, they had an opportunity and went completely south. Now all the rest of Alaska is owned by XXX next.
Exactly.
Not by the Native people, it's not by the Native corporations.
If nothing else, I hope by the end of these 2 days we all walk away with a real understanding that the federal Indian policy that affects Alaska is different than anywhere else in the United States, and that has complicated things, but it has also created some amazing institutions. So